A reporter asks the President of the United States a simple question. Does he still stand behind Article 5, the promise, written into NATO's founding treaty 76 years earlier, that an attack on one member is an attack on all? His answer isn't yes. Depends on your definition, he says. For a room full of European leaders who had spent three-quarters of a century treating that promise as the single most important sentence in their national security, the sentence that let them spend less on their own militaries, plan their own defenses around it, build their own alliances assuming it would always be there, those four words landed like a small earthquake. Because here's the uncomfortable truth underneath that moment. Article 5 was never actually the ironclad guarantee most Europeans believed it was. It was built, from its very first draft in 1948, to be vaguer than that, flexible enough that the United States could honor it exactly as much, or as little, as it chose to. Europe signed onto a defense alliance 76 years ago that it believed guaranteed American protection. What it actually got was something quieter and far more one-sided: American control with protection as the optional part. This is the story of the deal Europe never fully read, and is only now, in real time, starting to understand. Part 1. The promise that wasn't quite a promise. To understand how vague Article 5 actually is, you have to go back to the argument that nearly stopped NATO from existing at all. By December 1947, British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin, widely credited today as the true architect of what would become NATO, was convinced that Western Europe couldn't survive Soviet pressure alone. Four-party talks between Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and the United States over the future of occupied Germany had just collapsed. Bevin believed the Western democracies needed a hard, binding military alliance, and fast. The Europeans at the negotiating table wanted something simple and absolute. If any member was attacked, every other member would automatically go to war in their defense. No debate, no delay, no discretion. For countries that had just watched their own territory get invaded and occupied within living memory, automatic wasn't a technicality, it was the entire point. The United States said no. American negotiators, and the U.S. Congress they answered to, were deeply wary of signing a treaty that could drag the country into a European war without a vote, without deliberation, without control. The United States had spent the previous decade actively avoiding exactly that kind of binding entanglement. So over months of negotiation through late 1948 and early 1949, the language got softer and softer and softer, until it landed on the wording that exists today. An armed attack against one member shall be considered an attack against them all, and each member will respond with such action as it deems necessary, which may, but does not have to, include the use of armed force. Read that phrase again. As it deems necessary, not as required, not with immediate military force. As it deems necessary, a phrase that hands total discretion back to whichever country is deciding how to respond, including the United States. The treaty was signed by 12 founding members in Washington, D.C., on April 4, 1949. President Truman, at the signing ceremony, spoke about freedom and peace and the will of the world's people. What he didn't say, what nobody said out loud that day, was that the alliance's central promise had been deliberately engineered to be exactly as strong, or as weak, as Washington later chose to make it. Part 2. A promise invoked exactly once. For most of NATO's history, that built-in ambiguity didn't matter much, because the alliance's core purpose, deterring a massive Soviet military already amassed on the other side of a heavily fortified border, never actually required Article 5 to be tested. The promise did its job simply by existing, and by being backed, implicitly, by American power. Nobody needed to find out how far, as it deems necessary, would actually stretch. Until September 11, 2001. For the first and, so far, only time in NATO's history, a member state invoked Article 5, And it wasn't a European country being attacked by Russia. It was the United States, invoking the clause after the September 11th terrorist attacks, calling on its European allies to treat an attack on American soil as an attack on the whole alliance. Europe answered. NATO allies deployed forces to Afghanistan as part of the International Security Assistance Force, and stayed involved in that conflict for the better part of 2 decades. It's worth sitting with the irony here. The one and only time in history Article 5 has actually been triggered, it was invoked to bring European countries into an American war, not the other way around. The clause, built in 1949 to reassure Europe that America would come to its defense, has in practice been used exactly once, and it ran in the opposite direction. That single data point doesn't prove Article 5 is worthless, but it does mean that, right up to the summer of 2025, no one, not European leaders, not American ones, actually knew for certain what would happen if Article 5 were invoked the way its original drafters in Europe had imagined. A Soviet, or Russian, attack on a European member, with the United States being asked to respond. The clause had never been tested in that direction. It had only ever been tested in America's favor. Part 3. The command structure that made it permanent. If Article 5 was NATO's promise, the command structure built 2 years later was the mechanism that made sure that promise stayed under American control no matter what. The Korean War, breaking out in June 1950, terrified NATO's members into realizing that a written treaty alone wasn't enough. They needed a real, standing, integrated military command, ready to fight immediately if Europe faced the same kind of surprise attack. In December 1950, the North Atlantic Council announced the appointment of the alliance's first Supreme Allied Commander Europe, American General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the celebrated commander of Allied forces in the Second World War. His headquarters, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, or SHAPE, became operational in April 1951. Here's the detail that rarely gets examined closely. Every single Supreme Allied Commander Europe since Eisenhower, everyone for 75 straight years, has been an American 4-star general. It isn't written into NATO's founding treaty as a requirement. It's what defense analysts call a gentleman's agreement, an unwritten tradition so consistently honored that it functions as a rule anyway. And it's not a symbolic title. SACEUR commands all of NATO's military operations and is simultaneously, always, automatically, dual-hatted as the commander of United States European Command, meaning the same individual commanding NATO's forces is, at the very same moment, commanding a separate chain of American forces answering directly to Washington. In practice, this means the single most powerful military position in European defense has never, in the alliance's entire history, been held by a European. Even as recently as 2025, when reports surfaced that the Trump administration was considering restructuring U.S.-European command, the question of whether a European might finally take the SACEUR post generated genuine uncertainty in NATO capitals, because nobody could remember a scenario where that hadn't simply been assumed to be American by default. Part 4. The country that tried to leave. If you want to see what it actually costs a NATO member to push back against that command structure, there's a real historical case study, and it's dramatic. By the mid-1960s, French President Charles de Gaulle had grown convinced that NATO's integrated command was little more than American and British dominance wearing an alliance's clothing. He'd pushed, unsuccessfully, for a reformed tripartite leadership structure alongside the US and Britain. He'd accelerated France's independent nuclear weapons program specifically so the country wouldn't have to rely on American nuclear guarantees. And he was increasingly alarmed that NATO's structure could drag France into conflicts. It had no interest in Vietnam, chief among them. On March 7, 1966, de Gaulle informed President Lyndon Johnson by letter that France was withdrawing from NATO's integrated military command entirely. All foreign troops, American and Canadian forces stationed on French soil, were ordered to leave French territory. SHAPE itself, NATO's central military headquarters, had to physically relocate out of France, eventually settling in Casto, Belgium, where it remains to this day. France didn't leave the alliance itself. It remained a member of the North Atlantic Council, the political body. But for over 4 decades, it stood outside NATO's actual command structure, building and relying on its own independent nuclear deterrent and its own national defense posture, refusing to subordinate its forces to an American-led chain of command. It took 43 years for France to fully return. In 2009, under President Nicolas Sarkozy, France formally rejoined NATO's integrated military command, a decision that remains politically contested in France to this day, with critics on both the left and the nationalist right describing it as a betrayal of de Gaulle's vision of true French independence. France's decades-long experiment is the clearest evidence available for what opting out of American-led command actually costs a European power: isolation from the alliance's central planning, a far heavier independent defense burden, and eventually, in most tellings of the story, a quiet return to the very structure it once rejected, because building a fully independent alternative, even for one of Europe's largest military powers, proved harder than staying inside America's system. Part 5. The WAPONS Europe HOSTS but doesn't control. Nowhere is the asymmetry of the NATO deal more literal than in the alliance's nuclear posture, because in this case, it isn't metaphorical control. It's control over actual nuclear weapons, sitting on European soil. Since the 1950s, the United States has stationed nuclear gravity bombs at military bases across several NATO member countries, under an arrangement known as nuclear sharing. Today, an estimated 100 B-61 series nuclear bombs are stored at 6 bases across 5 countries: Belgium, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Turkey. In a crisis, these weapons could be loaded onto host nations' own aircraft: Belgian, German, Italian, Dutch, Turkish pilots flying their own planes. But here's the arrangement's defining feature: the weapons themselves are, at every moment, owned, maintained, and controlled exclusively by the United States. Host countries provide the aircraft, the infrastructure, the base security. They do not own the bombs. They cannot arm them. They cannot launch a nuclear mission without explicit authorization running through NATO's Nuclear Planning Group and ultimately requiring approval from the President of the United States. It is, by design, sharing the responsibility and the risk of hosting nuclear weapons, without ever sharing actual custody or control. This arrangement has only grown more relevant, not less, since Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine. NATO has openly discussed expanding nuclear sharing infrastructure eastward, toward Poland and the Baltic states, the most significant proposed expansion of this system since the end of the Cold War. And in a mirror image worth noting, Russia has begun stationing its own nuclear weapons on Belarusian soil under a strikingly similar arrangement, suggesting nuclear sharing, on both sides of the new Iron Curtain, remains one of the most effective tools a major power has for keeping a smaller allied nation permanently entwined with, and dependent on, its nuclear umbrella. Part 6. Who actually pays for all of this? The financial side of the NATO deal has quietly become its most publicly contentious front, and it reveals just how much leverage spending itself has become. For most of NATO's history, there was no hard spending requirement at all, simply an informal expectation that members would contribute meaningfully to their own defense. That changed in 2006, when NATO defense ministers agreed on a guideline. Member nations should aim to spend at least 2% of their GDP on defense. It remained a soft guideline, widely ignored, until Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea alarmed the alliance enough to formalize it as the Wales Defence Investment Pledge, a commitment to move towards 2% by 2024. By NATO's own count, only 3 member states met that 2% threshold in 2014. A decade later, in 2024, 23 did. The gap between American and European contributions, though, remained the alliance's most persistent sore spot. The United States alone has historically accounted for roughly 2/3 of NATO's total combined defense spending, a figure that gave successive American presidents, and particularly Donald Trump, a powerful and repeated talking point about European nations being what he's called free riders, relying on American taxpayers to fund their own security. Trump pushed the number further than any predecessor. Beginning in his second term, he publicly demanded NATO members raise their target all the way to 5% of GDP, more than double the existing pledge. At the alliance's June 2025 summit in The Hague, NATO members formally agreed to precisely that, a new pledge to reach 5% of GDP by 2035, split between 5% on core military spending, and 1.5% on broader security-related investment, including infrastructure and cyber defense, expected to add roughly $1 trillion a year to the alliance's combined resources once fully phased in. It's worth being precise about what that pledge actually represents. It isn't money paid to the United States. It's money European countries commit to spending on their own militaries. But the leverage embedded in the arrangement is unmistakable. The country that built still commands and still holds ultimate discretion over the alliance's central promise is also the country that gets to set, publicly, repeatedly, and successfully, how much every other member is required to spend to remain in its good graces. Part 7. The deal read closely. Which brings us back to The Hague, June 2025, and those 4 words. Depends on your definition. Taken together, everything this video has laid out reframes what actually happened in that press conference. It wasn't Donald Trump inventing a new, more transactional version of NATO. It was Donald Trump saying, out loud and on camera, something that had been quietly true about the alliance since December 1948, that Article 5's protection was never actually automatic, that the command structure enforcing it has always run through Washington, that the nuclear weapons stationed on European soil have never actually belonged to the countries hosting them, and that the one country ever caught testing what happens if a member steps outside that structure spent 43 years finding out how costly independence actually is. None of this means NATO has been a bad deal for Europe. 76 years without a direct war between a NATO member and Russia is not a small achievement, and American military power genuinely has underwritten European peace and prosperity for 3 generations in a way few other arrangements in history can claim. That part of the story is real, and it deserves to be told alongside this one, not instead of it. But it does mean the deal Europe signed in 1949 was never quite the deal most Europeans have spent the decades since believing they'd signed. It was never an unconditional guarantee. It was always a piece of deliberately flexible language, backed by a command structure that was never going to be handed over, protecting weapons that were never going to change ownership, funded increasingly on terms that Washington, not Brussels, gets to set. Europe is only now under real pressure, a war on its own continent, an American president willing to say the quiet part out loud, going back and reading the fine print it signed onto 3/4 of a century ago. And what it's finding is a treaty that was never quite as automatic, and never quite as equal, as the last 76 years of peace allowed everyone to comfortably assume.